At OnChart, we take great care to ensure our stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. The views shared reflect those of the individual speaking and do not represent the employers. You're listening to OnChart. I'm Lengwing.
And I'm Tremaine Ansani.
We all know what history is.
History.
We know history matters because we are part of history. This is best captured in the saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In a TED Talk, historian Karen Cox said, history matters not just because there's always something to learn from the past, but also because history informs us about current events.
That historians aren't just interested in the facts and the dates, they're interested in the how and the why and what motivates people to do what they do, whether they're doing that to better the world around them or they're doing it because of their hatred for other people. Pick any subject that's in current events right now: immigration, terrorism, Black Lives Matter, nationalism. I could go on, and there's a history for all of that. There's a history for all of that that informs what is taking place today.
In medicine, healthcare providers rely on medical history to make diagnoses, but that's not all they seek to obtain from their patients. There is family history, which informs about any conditions that tends to run in the family. There's also social history, which tells doctors about the patient's lifestyle and any social support they may have at home. There's no denying that history matters in medicine. But what about history as an academic view? What can clinicians gain from learning about the historical development of medical knowledge, like germ theories, antibiotics, and vaccinations? Dr. Andrew Lamb has the answers. Currently an attending retinal surgeon at Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, Massachusetts, and an assistant professor of ophthalmology at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, Dr. Lamb sees writing and teaching medical history as part of his life mission.
I've also found a lot of fulfillment through pursuing my passion for history, which is something I've always had since I was young. I studied history when I was in college, and I was able to kind of continue to explore that throughout my career. I've written four books. Two were historical novels of World War II because I had really focused on military history in college as my passion. And I've also written a book, kind of a memoir slash history of ophthalmology called Saving Sight, about the greatest stories of development and innovation in ophthalmology. And then my latest book, The Masters of Medicine, about the greatest discoveries in medicine um, in all fields.
To Dr. Lamb, history has always been his passion.
I never thought I'd be a writer when I was growing up, but I loved history. I was a kid who would just go to the library and read all the biographies and histories in the children's section of the library.
He chose to study military history as an undergrad at Yale University and had hoped to become a historian upon graduation. Except he didn't become a historian. Contrary to expectations, he was drawn to what he felt was a more compelling calling: medicine.
I had a father who was a cardiologist, and don't get me wrong, he did not care if I was going to be a doctor or not. He didn't push me to do anything. But I grew up in Springfield, Illinois, which is in the middle of the states, a very, kind of a small community. And when I was a kid, it wouldn't be unusual for people at the mall or on the street to literally stop me and my family to thank my dad for saving their life or the life of their mom or their dad. And when you're a kid, these kind of experiences make an indelible mark on you, where you kind of realize, wow, being a doctor could be a really great way to spend your life helping people, right? And um, that's kind of what initially spurred me to be interested in it. When I was in college, I certainly had considered going to kind of get a history PhD and writing history books, but that feeling of just helping people and doing things that few people can do to help them showed me that being a doctor could be a really great profession.
Except he didn't follow his father's footsteps.
So my father was a good role model, but one of the things I was very observant as a kid, obviously, and like one of the things I noticed was, boy, he worked really hard. It was very unusual to have dinner together. He was always getting up in the middle of the night to like go open up people's coronary arteries during their heart attacks. So I did want the fulfillment of helping people, but I wanted to kind of have a better life. And to be honest, it's in my generation, unlike his, it's a lot different. You know, being a physician in his generation was characterized by basically being a doctor was your entire identity. Like there was a great deal of respect to physicians. Frankly, dads were not expected to do much for regarding child rearing. I think the first diaper my dad changed might have been my son's diaper. You know, like it's basically now dads are expected to do a lot, and that's good, obviously. And I feel like I was a very active parent, and my wife and I were very active together as a team raising our kids. But now kind of lifestyle is a lot more valuable. I or a lot more highly considered. I was training just before they started the 80-hour work rule in residency, and so that's another example, maybe 25 years ago, where um, they made a change, right? So it's another kind of a cultural shift, and it's obviously in many ways for the better. Um, so I said to myself, I don't really I wanna be a doctor, but I don't wanna work quite as hard as my dad, and it just so happened when I was in medical school, I realized, wow, I'm really kind of interested in surgery. I wanted to be a surgeon. I'm kind of an impatient person. I like to help people right away and do things, with my hands, and so when I did an ophthalmology rotation, it was only a week long. I was blown away. I was a myopic kid like a lot of medical students, and I loved going to the eye doctor because after the experience, I could see clearly. It's a lot different from going to the dentist, obviously, and I just found the eye fascinating. I think sight is such a precious sense of ours, and I loved ophthalmology. And in ophthalmology, I would say that retina is definitely considered kind of the most the field that's the most emergent in the sense that it handles the most serious diseases. So it is true. It's kind of like the most training you can get in the field, but it's still a far cry from how demanding and how difficult and challenging and lifestyle wise my father's career was. So that's kind of why I went into retina surgery. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a surgeon. I wanted a better lifestyle than my dad.
So, for those who don't know about retinal surgery, can you describe what it is and your scope of practice as a retinal surgeon?
Yeah. So for those who aren't aware, you do ophthalmology residency, and that allows you to basically be a cataract surgeon. You could be a LASIK surgeon. You can do a lot of different things, which is all very valuable. Treat kids, elderly people, everything in between. There are actually 7 fellowships you can do after ophthalmology residency. You can do glaucoma, cornea, uveitis, pediatrics, pathology, retina, okay? So retina is the longest of those. It's a 2-year fellowship, and we are now able to if you do a retina fellowship, you can operate in the back of the eye. No resident's really gonna do retina surgery. These are typically called vitrectomies, where we're taking out the vitreous jelly, which allows us to approach the back of the eye to fix things like retinal detachments, macular holes, peel epiretinal membranes, take out vitreous hemorrhage and from diabetic retinopathy, fish out dislocated intraocular lenses that have been fallen out of place after cataract surgery, repair ruptured globes. So there's a lot of things that we do. In my practice, nobody gets an appointment unless it's referred from a comprehensive ophthalmologist. So actually, we're dealing with the things that they don't handle, essentially. A very common thing we treat is macular degeneration. Wet macular degeneration is the most common cause of blindness in the elderly in the US. We do a lot of intravitreal injections of anti-VEGF injections with names like Avastin, Eylea, Vabysmo to try to halt or arrest or slow down the effects of wet macular degeneration, which is characterized by leaking and bleeding blood vessels under the macula, and that's from age, obviously. So that's the kind of conditions we handle.
And what's the favorite part of your practice?
My favorite part of the day is after I do a surgery and I get to go out and tell the family it went perfectly and it went very well. And because I know that they've been anxious the whole time and the surgeries, like any field, what I do is usually quite rote and routine for me because I'm doing it all the time, and I've been doing it for a while, so that's I've seen most things I might encounter. Of course, the exciting things, strange, unusual things, especially like in trauma, might come up where you can't you handle things you've never seen before. But generally, it's pretty routine, but it's never routine for the patient family, right? There's no such thing as minor surgery. So I love being able to go out and just tell them it went perfectly and well, and then you see their breath of happiness and sigh of relief, and that's very meaningful to me. And then also, you know, I love the feeling of being able to help people in a way that very few people can, especially if you go to certain parts of the country where there really aren't enough of a certain kind of specialty. There aren't a lot of retina specialists in the country. You don't need that many of them. Not everyone's getting retinal detachments and things like that. But the fact is, like, not that many people can do after you go through all this training, and I'm speaking now to all the re residents in training and medical students out there. It's a long road, but in the end, you have a skill that very few people have, and, um, I think that nobody no matter what happens in medicine, no matter what happens with, reimbursements, insurance, bureaucracy, that's fundamentally the reason why you should wanna go into medicine, and nobody can take that away from you.
With such confidence and conviction, Dr. Lam went into medicine knowing that he had a unique skill set to serve the field and his future patients. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, he entered residency at the Wills Eye Hospital in Philadelphia, specializing in ophthalmology and retinal surgery. He had, as people like to say, accomplished it all. But something didn't feel right. The more he advanced in his practice as a retinal surgeon, the more he found himself regressing to his college vocation in history.
When I was in residency, I had this thought, I was kinda daydreaming one night late in the ER when I was working a shift, and I said to myself, "It's such a pity I can't share everything I know about World War II in China with people," because that's what I had focused on as an undergrad, and I realized I didn't have time to write a nonfiction book, but maybe I could write a novel, 'cause a nonfiction book would require a lot of research, interviews, and travel, and I was a busy resident with kids, but I could dream up a story and use that historical novel to share the history that I wanted to convey to people, and that became a novel called Two Sons of China, and I got a book agent, and I got a book deal, it was great, and then when you have a book agent, you're suddenly thinking all the time, like, "What else could I write about?" Because now I have access, and the agent can help me get my book published, and I decided to write a book about the history of ophthalmology, uh, and I went to my agent and I said, "This is it. I've got a great idea about the heroes of ophthalmology. They're really incredible stories. A lot of them have to do with World War II, a lot of serendipity, perseverance, luck, and lucky mistakes and things like that." And she said, "Yeah, that's not going to work because nobody's really going to buy a book about ophthalmological history." And I was really disappointed, but I said I didn't wanna give up, and I said to myself, "Well, what if I tried to make it more marketable by trying to include my own memoir as a surgeon in training to take people into the operating room so they can see what it's like to try to save sight, or maybe more interestingly, what it's like when we're up against difficult complications and you're not exactly sure what to do and all the options are bad." And that book became Saving Sight, which was successful and very meaningful to I still get lots of like emails people telling me it inspired them to go into ophthalmology and medicine. That was great. So ever since the success of that book, people have been asking me to do a book like that for all of medicine, and that's how the Master of Medicine came about. And so I realized that, boy, not only ophthalmology has great stories, but there are incredible stories in all fields, like cardiology, cancer development, the discovery of insulin for diabetes and things like that. So these stories were full of just unsung heroes who were very plenty of foibles, just like all of us. They're guilty of envy and arrogance and things like that. And they were very human stories, and that's why I wrote The Master of Medicine. And I will try to make it very relevant to people. So each chapter, as you know, is a deadly disease like infection, heart disease, cancer, um, and diabetes and things like that. So it tried to make it very relevant because all these diseases touch all of us, And the stories are just full of unsung heroes and incredible stories of serendipity, luck, and sometimes arrogance and rivalry.
So, what did you learn from your research? And what surprised you most? Was it the serendipity, luck, the arrogance, or the rivalry? What was it?
I think one of the things that surprised me was how rivalry often played a role in making discoveries. So I'll just give you a couple examples. So in the 1800s, there were these two microbe hunters. They were kind of like the first successful microbiologists, and their names are Louis Pasteur, which many have heard of, and Robert Koch, which many have also heard of, especially if you're in medicine. And these guys, so Pasteur was from France and Koch was from Germany, and these guys hated each other. Like they were basically trying to outdo each other all the time. This was a time of great nationalism, and France and Germany hated each other. Like in 1870, there was like a Franco-Prussian war. All these nations hated each other, and so like they kept Pasteur and Koch were both brilliant, and they were trading discoveries. For example, like Pasteur basically like discovered bacteria in the 1860s. Then Koch discovered the cause of anthrax in 1876, and then Pasteur discovered like an anthrax vaccine, and then Koch discovered what caused TB in 1882, and then he discovered what caused cholera a year later. It was incredible. Like so many amazing discoveries were being made in a short time. Pasteur answered this with a rabies vaccine a few years later. And so these guys would go to meetings and literally sometimes there's one time Pasteur was giving a speech, and Koch was in the first row, like jumping up and down, trying to distract him, and taking like what Pasteur said as an insult, and then they would basically hurl insults at each other in journals, and these would make the national press. And so I think without a doubt that rivalry was a very acrimonious, spurred those guys to develop things faster and to keep working and not rest on their laurels.
The rivalry between Pasteur and Koch spanned multiple years and across many pressing research areas, including anthrax, vaccines, and, most importantly, tuberculosis, which was one of the leading causes of death worldwide in the 19th century. Koch's 1882 announcement that he had isolated Mycobacterium tuberculosis galvanized the scientific community, including Pasteur's circle. Although Pasteur did not directly compete on tuberculosis, the discovery pushed Pasteur to accelerate his work on rabies, leading to the development of the first rabies vaccines by 1885. The rivalry between Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch is a testament to the idea that competition can accelerate scientific progress.
Another example that's very relevant to Americans of the 20th century was Salk and Sabin, for example, in the race for the polio vaccine. These guys had very different ideas of what would make the best polio vaccine. So Salk wanted a killed vaccine, which would be kind of the easiest way to do it, but a lot of people criticized that approach because they thought the vaccine would be weak and not very long lasting. And Sabin thought an attenuated live vaccine would be better. It would be harder to make, but might maybe be lifelong. And so they basically had a very difficult relationship in the sense that like Sabin, who was older, didn't have a very good opinion of Salk. He thought Salk was kind of like a neophyte, novice, like less experienced upstart. And so Salk developed his vaccine first, obviously, which was wonderful, and it worked really well. But even then, like Sabin was like testifying against him in Congress, saying like it's not safe and things like that. Sabin eventually developed his vaccine, and it kind of supplanted Salk's. But the point is, like those guys here's another example of the stakes are very high, because many kids were getting paralyzed from polio, and they spurred each other, I think, to work harder and develop things faster for the benefit of all of us.
After the polio vaccine was successfully manufactured and released for public use in 1955, polio cases started to plummet. In the US, the number went from over 57,000 cases and 3,000 deaths at the peak of the polio outbreak in 1952 to fewer than 10 reported cases annually by the late 1970s, before it was declared eliminated in the US in 1979. In addition to triumphs in medicine, The book also shed light on disturbing trends that define the prevailing belief that advances in medicine are always linear. In the early 1900s, as the US modernized its approach to maternal care, the outcomes for pregnant women were far from reassuring. In 1920, 8 out of every 1,000 births ended in the mother's deaths. Tens of thousands of American women die each year from infections that could have been prevented. Between 1920 and 1929 alone, more than 250,000 American women died in childbirth, with roughly half of those deaths due to sepsis. Others were caused by hemorrhage, pulmonary embolisms, unsafe abortions, C-sections, and excessive anesthesia. Ironically, childbirth was statistically safer for American mothers in the 1800s than it was in 1930.
Yeah, what was interesting about that was when there was a transition from childbirth at home to childbirth in hospitals. And in the early 20th century, basically, why was this happening? Well, it was because the obstetricians, who are almost all male, wanted to make life a little bit easier for themselves, right? So they didn't want to go to people's houses and travel around. They wanted all the patients to come to them. And if all the pregnant women delivering were all in one place, then they could do more business and things like that. But the problem is, there was some evidence that male obstetricians were very likely to kind of intervene, and they would be impatient. They wouldn't let things run their course. So they might use forceps, for example, earlier, or do more interventions, which sometimes led to more infections, because this was an era before antibiotics, essentially. So there were reports in New York, where like the public health people said like it's very dangerous to deliver in our hospitals because the maternal mortality was very, very high. Now, eventually things got much better, right? Antibiotics really stopped people from having like high rates of puerperal fever and things like that. So that eventually became very, very safe in hospitals. But that transition was a rough one.
I'm curious, were there any stories that didn't make it to publication?
Yeah, every book I've written, the editor quite appropriately has said it's too long. We need to make it shorter. Concise is always good. Um, there were multiple stories that didn't make it. So here's a great one. Like the history of anesthesia, okay, is an incredible story. And I was going to put that in in the trauma chapter that I wrote, but that was sacrificed. So this story is just another example of terrible rivalry. I'll briefly tell it. So, there was this dentist named Horace Wells in Hartford, Connecticut, who had been to like demonstrations of nitrous oxide, where basically these showmen would let people inhale nitrous oxide, and then everyone would be entertained by how crazy people acted on the stage, like they're out of their mind, they're pretending to be an animal, things like that. And so he noticed that one of these people, after they had gotten kind of inebriated with nitrous oxide, injured himself, like injured his leg, but didn't feel any pain. And he said, "Wait a second, maybe I could pull out some people's teeth and give them nitrous oxide so they won't feel pain." So he did that, okay? And he managed to like get an audience at Mass General in the 1840s and demonstrated. But unfortunately, during that demonstration, the patient cried out, apparently in pain. Later, maybe he said, "Oh, I wasn't really feeling that much pain." But the point is, people thought Wells was a charlatan. Now, there was another guy named William Morton who had kind of been an apprentice to him, who knew that Wells was actually a very highly regarded dentist. And so Morton said, "Well, wait a second, I think this idea has merit, but let's try to use ether, okay?" And he went to a professor named Charles Jackson, who was at Harvard, and Jackson kind of helped him like uh find like devise the apparatus like a mask and things. And so Morton, now this is world famous, it's called Ether Day, went to Mass General and successfully demonstrated ether in the first operation ever there with anesthesia. And so it's great. So that news spread like wildfire, and all around the world people are starting to use ether. Then Morton tries to get the credit for this, okay? Because he wants the credit, and he wants like the government to give him financial rewards. So now these three guys embark on this incredible story of like self-destructive credit seeking. So Morton says, I'm the inventor of anesthesia. Then Jackson says, no, I'm the inventor. I gave you the entire idea to do it with ether. And then Wells says, wait a second, 2 years ago, I did it first in with nitrous oxide. And these guys basically spent their entire careers trying to like get affidavits, get articles written about themselves, and it was really bad and literally led to their deaths in the sense that like Wells said, I'm going to keep trying to discover stuff. He tried to work with chloroform and he started like using it himself, and it basically he became kind of dependent on it. And then he at one point he like made him go crazy, and he threw acid on some prostitutes in New York and got arrested, and he was mortified, so he committed suicide. And then Morton, basically there was an article that was basically crediting Jackson with it, with the invention, and Morton was so upset he kind of went crazy, and he ended up going running into at one point running into a lake and drowning or dying after he ran into a lake. And then when Jackson saw his tombstone in which they wrote he was the inventor, Jackson kind of went insane, and he was in an insane asylum where he died. So it was nuts. And the last thing I'll say is all of this was kind of moot because this other guy named Crawford Long in Georgia had actually been the first to use anesthesia on a patient, and he never published it until after all of this. But he had affidavits that proved he was the first guy. So anyway, that's a story that didn't make in the book, but it's a great one. You could write an entire book on that story, frankly.
So, in the beginning of the book, you mentioned that by the end of the century, scientists will have found a cure for cancer, and that's surprised me because I thought not all cancer is curable. Is that right?
Not right now, yeah.
So, how did you land on that statement?
So, first of all, cancer is a disease that touches everybody. I think every one of us has had a loved one who's had cancer or died of cancer or overcome cancer. Cancer itself is a heterogeneous. It's kind of a label that goes to like over 100 different actual diseases. So as you know, some cancers are easily treatable, or some cancers are indolent, and that you might have cancer, but it's not the thing that's going to kill you. And other cancers are just very, very virulent and very difficult and bad. So I think that we've made incredible strides in oncology. I mean, when you think of CAR T and immunotherapy, it's incredible. And in my chapter on cancer, I kind of enjoyed explaining how rudimentary our initial treatments for this were, and how in the development of chemotherapy, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, where we were just trying to find things like out in nature, testing every root, plant, animal stuff to try to find something that has some anti-cancer qualities. And there were some lucky breaks, but now I think that we're in a golden age where our ability to do molecular genetic treatments, uh, just our understanding is at a much better level. And I'm sure 100 years from now we'll look back at today and people will say, boy, their understanding was very rudimentary then too. But I'm optimistic that we're going to make great strides. I feel like this 21st century is like the century of the biomedical century. Like the 1800s was kind of like the century for chemistry when they were figuring out all this great stuff in chemistry. 20th century was more physics. It was a nuclear age. And that changed the world. And now biomedical science is like very, very important. Like even just the mRNA vaccines for COVID, that was an incredible breakthrough that's going to change all our lives, especially.
The golden age of oncology brought remarkable advances in cancer diagnosis and treatments, targeted therapies, immunotherapy, and improved survival rates. But even in the midst of these breakthroughs, a shift was underway. Physicians and public health leaders began to realize that curing cancer wasn't enough. Preventing it had to be the next frontier. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that more than 40% of cancer in the United States are linked to preventable risk factors, including smoking, poor diet, obesity, physical inactivity, and alcohol use, according to the World Health Organization. At least one third of cancer deaths worldwide are due to five behavioral and dietary risks: high body mass index, low fruits and vegetable intake, lack of physical activity, tobacco use, and alcohol use. In Masters of Medicine, Dr. Lam claims that, quote, prevention efforts, especially smoking cessation, save countless lives. Investigators have elucidated not only the molecular basis for cancer, as complex as that has proven to be, but also the means to deploy new weapons from another scientific discipline, immunology. In the coming decades, it is feasible to envision cancer screening by a simple blood test. If an abnormality is found, preventative treatments could be offered to prevent the formation of cancer at all. End quote.
I think that that's right. You know, we spend a lot of time lauding the people who developed like angioplasty, right? And we're amazed by cardiac surgeons and what they can do. But the reality is, just like the invention of statins has, I'm sure, saved many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives over like people who we treat after they've already had a heart attack. And without a doubt, you know, today I feel like it's true. Prevention is getting a lot more attention than it used to. You know, you see like Michelle Obama having a campaign to like get kids to move and prevent obesity, or the Surgeon General is highlighting mental health. You know, 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago, I don't think the Surgeon Generals cared much about mental health, anxiety and depression, right? Like they, you know, people are thinking about like lung cancer and smoking and things like that. So I think prevention is becoming a more is definitely people are highlighting it more than before. And that's good because it's a lot easier to prevent diseases usually when they're new and early than to deal with the aftermath.
And that's exactly what Dr. Lam has been doing to prevent diseases by bringing to the public history of different diseases, the causes of their progression, and the treatment methods that were discovered, and what's currently being developed to help advance medicine. For someone who spent his whole life treating eye diseases, being able to share his passion for history is a gift. But even more, being able to use his knowledge to support his loved ones brings him joy. Seeing them brings him joy.
So at my stage in life, I have four kids and three are in college. So I think without a doubt, I think people of perhaps your generation are going to see, you know, family is pretty much the most important thing, right? And I think that for many years I was a dad. I was like helping out with kids programs and activities and chauffeuring them all over the place.
So, what's down the pipeline for you? Are you planning to write another book soon? What can we expect to see a few years from now?
Well, I must say that, you know, the good thing is as a doctor, I don't have to write to feed my family because that would be a lot more challenging, a lot more painful because, you know, I get to only write what I'm passionate about. And the thing about me is I kind of feel like, for better or worse, I get passionate about different ideas, you know, like I wrote a novel about World War II, that's Two Sons of China. Then I wrote a novel about Japanese Americans in World War II called Repentance. And in the meantime, I wrote a nonfiction book about medical history, The Masters of Medicine. And you know, as a my editors are probably thinking this doesn't make much sense. An author should stick with the same genre and, you know, utilize all of the benefits and the connections marketing wise that we've already established from his prior books. So I don't know exactly what book I'm going to write next. If I was smart, I think it'd be interesting to write like a military book where we talk about like the medical developments from military campaigns and things like that. The title of that would be great if it was one of my favorite adages is the only winner in war is medicine. Um, but at the same time, like I just love doing new things. You know, I'm an elected official in my town in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, and so I've gotten involved in governments, and I think that it would be very interesting to kind of write an Asian American memoir and talk a little bit about my upbringing and um, government service and incorporate all of that. Another thing that I find very interesting is like studying unintended consequences in history. A lot of that does relate to government, but also like lots of aspects of business and the ecological problems that people have made mistakes. So I think that would be very fascinating. So we'll see. I'm mulling it all over.
This episode of On Charts was produced by me, Lei Wing, and Charmaine Ansani. Special thanks to Kayla Wong, our editor-in-chief, for giving this episode the best shape possible. Our original theme music and additional music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. If you enjoyed this episode, please help others find us by sharing this episode on social media or leave us a comment. I'm your host, Lei. See you next time.